My first question is to the Premier. Dr. Brooke Fallis, the respected head of William Osler's Critical Care Department in Brampton, was fired from his position back in January of 2021. The Premier was asked by media about his calls of complaint to the then CEO about Dr. Fallis's tweets. At the time, on February 2nd, 2021, the Premier said, and I quote, regarding these calls, 100% false, and it just didn't happen. However, recordings released by W5 clearly show that perhaps this is not, in fact, what happened. They show otherwise, Speaker. So my question is, does the Premier still stand behind those statements today, considering that W5's evidence is clearly contrary to what the Premier claimed?
Deputy Premier and Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, at the time of his claims, neither my office nor the office of the Premier had ever heard of this individual, and his claims remain categorically false. In fact, William Osler has already publicly acknowledged that at no time has the Premier's office ever given any direction or advice relating to health human resources at the hospital. Since the onset of the pandemic, our office has and has continued to rely upon the advice given by the Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Moore, and by his advisors with respect to actions that they recommended be taken during the course of the pandemic, and no one else.
Supplementary question.
Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Health made the exact same claim, that they had, quote, never heard of him. But W5's FOI documents show the exact opposite, Speaker. And the recording that was taken of the CEO of William Osler Health System, Dr. Naveed Mohammed, on November 16th of 2020 confirms that, and I quote, "I've been warned a number of times that these guys in the government have a very, very long memory. These guys remember. That's the first thing we're afraid of." The first thing we're afraid of is what Dr. Mohammed was saying. He also said that he said on this same recording that the Premier of this province had called him multiple times. So the question is, does the Premier still stand by his claim that none of this happened, that he didn't call the CEO of William Osler Health System multiple times in November of 2020?
Minister of Health.
Thank you. Well, the Premier may have spoken with the CEO of the hospital, but they would have been about medical issues, pandemic-related issues, not to comments made by someone that none of us had ever heard of. As the leader of the official opposition may recall, there were many doctors in many locations had lots to say about the pandemic. However, no action was ever taken against them because they are entitled to their opinion. However, the opinions that this government relied upon were the opinions of Dr. Williams and then Dr. Moore and the other official advisors to our government.
Final supplementary.
Well, Speaker, hospital officials told Dr. Fallis that they were worried funding for other important health initiatives and projects would be at risk. They were feeling intimidated, apparently, and threatened, apparently. The hospital chief of staff, Dr. David Bortz, in fact, told Dr. Fallis on November the 16th, 2020, and I quote, "That's how these guys play the game. And whether you like it or not, they are the paymasters. These guys can be nasty in a way that you don't even know they're being nasty." This is what they're saying about the government, about the Premier of this province, Speaker. So why would the Chief of Staff of the hospital believe the Premier and his government, the paymasters, are being nasty if it wasn't because of phone calls from the Premier to the CEO of William Osler?
The Minister of Health.
There is no reason for anyone to have felt intimidated because there were no actions ever taken. There were no discussions. And Osler has already publicly acknowledged that there was no direction, no advice, none whatsoever by the Premier of the province. And none of us had ever even heard of this person until he came forward with his allegations. As I said before, those allegations are categorically false, and the only advice that we have relied upon is the advice from Dr. Moore and his advisors, and that will continue to remain the same.
My
Next question, Leader of the
Thank you,
Opposition.
Speaker. My next question is also to the Premier. Well, maybe the Minister of Health might want to consider the fact that they're still afraid of what the government might do, which is why they're perhaps saying that these things didn't happen. But look, Dr. Fallis said very clearly in his latest interview that after he tweeted about the pandemic on November 5th, and I quote, the CEO had received a phone call from Doug Ford, who was upset about what I was saying publicly. That's what Dr. Fallis said. Multiple hospital officials said the exact same thing, Speaker. The hospital felt such political pressure that they hauled Dr. Fallis into a Zoom meeting over his tweets. They told him they were afraid, that these guys were nasty. They said the Premier had been calling. My question is, why would all of these people make this stuff up?
Minister of Health.
I have absolutely no idea, because there were no communications. While the Premier may have spoken with with Dr. Mohammed, it would have been about issues relating to the pandemic, not about actions or tweets given by a certain individual. That is not something that the Premier concerned himself with. He concerned about the health and safety of the people of Ontario, and that is why we continue to rely on the advice of Dr. Moore and his advisors, the people at the public health measures tables and other places, to give our government advice, which has served us very well given the state that we're in right now. We have relied on Dr. Moore's advice and will continue to do so because he and advisors know what they're talking about.
Supplementary.
Well, Speaker, on November 5th, 2020, Dr. Fallis was told that the Premier of Ontario called the head of his hospital to complain about his tweets. Dr. Fallis then got a cease and desist letter. He got a cease and desist letter from his hospital to stop tweeting. Yet the government, the Premier, denies that any of this even happened. The question here is about the character of our Premier, the character of this Premier and what he himself has done. So my question is, why would the entire leadership of this hospital believe that they needed to muzzle Dr. Fallis? That's what they believed. They needed to muzzle Dr. Fallis, fearing for their funding, fearing that their funding would be at risk if there wasn't any political pressure at all to do so. It does not make sense, Speaker.
Members will please take their seats. To respond, the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, listen to what the Leader of the Opposition is saying. She was saying that we were so upset that we wanted to take action. But you're right. We did take action. So what we did was we delivered a brand new hospital for Brampton, Mr. Speaker. We were so angry that we decided we're going to give them a medical school in Brampton, Mr. Speaker. We were so frustrated that we said, why don't we give them better GO train service in Brampton? Mr. Speaker, we were so angry we said, let's send them millions of dollars more for long-term care in their area, Mr. Speaker. What we were angry about is the complete failure of the Liberals and NDP to ever deliver anything for Brampton, Mr. Speaker. Anything for Brampton. Zero. And that is what we have been doing since day one, isn't it, colleagues? We've been delivering for the people of Brampton every single day, including a new hospital, long-term care, better education, better roads, transit, transportation, Mr. Speaker, a medical school, a university. I think that's delivering for Brampton. She should get on board and work with us. Deliver more.
The final supplementary.
Well, Speaker, it's very clear what the Premier of this province should do is admit what he did back in November of 2020 and come clean with the people of Ontario. That's what he should do. Everyone knows how this Premier handled the pandemic, Speaker. Hundreds of thousands of people contracted COVID-19. Thousands and thousands of people lost their lives. Doctors speaking out against this government's terrible pandemic response should be heard. They should be heard, not fired, Speaker. Hospital CEOs should never have to worry that the Premier's vengeance is going to threaten their funding. So my question is, will the Premier do the right thing? Will he just come clean? Will he apologize to Dr. Fallis, to the William Osler Health System, to Ontarians? And not only should he apologize, but we're also asking that he promise to never, ever threaten the funding, the healthcare funding of a hospital because he's unhappy, because he wants to muzzle critics.
And the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition is doing is really highlighting her failure. Yes. Her failure. I think look, this is a member who held the balance of power between 2011 and 2014. Did they do anything to help Brampton? No. They settled on stretch goals for insurance, and what did they accomplish? Nothing, Mr. Speaker. Nothing, Mr. Speaker. So what have we accomplished? A brand new hospital for the people of Brampton, Mr. Speaker. Of course, now they voted against that. They voted against it, Speaker. A brand new university for Brampton. How did they vote? Against it, Mr. Speaker. Millions of dollars in long-term care. How did they vote? Against it, Mr. Speaker. We've seen auto insurance rates come down in Brampton. How did they vote? Against it, Mr. Speaker. When you talk about the pandemic, there is no jurisdiction in North America that has done better than the province of Ontario because of the hard work of this Minister of Health, this Premier, Mr. Speaker, and this caucus, who have never failed in supporting the people of the province of Ontario and especially the people of Brampton.
Stop the clock.